Outer Wilds was released in May 2019 for Xbox One and PC. It's an open-world space exploration game which runs inside a closed time loop. Every 22 minutes, the game world resets and the player is thrown back to where they began, a system reminiscent of Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask. Much like in Majora's Mask, the time loop here ends with a cataclysmic event. Rather than the moon falling from the sky, here the sun explodes and destroys everything in the solar system. It's tempting to think that this is what defines the game, the ever-present, looming sense of dread, the knowledge that this will all end and that death is just around the corner. And it absolutely is an effective and highly dramatic narrative framing for the game's time loop, if an unoriginal one. But I don't think this is really what's interesting or noteworthy about the game, or even what's memorable about it. Not only is death one of the single most common metaphors for fail states in video games, for restarting and trying again, but this kind of haunting existential angst is central to the human condition and something we all have to cope with in our everyday lives. Not only on a personal level, knowing that we'll die and reflecting on our own mortality, but on a global level too, with issues like the threat of fascism and the growing climate emergency. And why not take it further still, to a galactic level? What's the nature of the universe we find ourselves in? Our own sun is going to die. Maybe the expansion of the universe itself will pull us further and further apart from the sun and our neighbouring planets, and we'll all freeze or starve to death in a lonely, pitch-black void, assuming human civilization even survives long enough to suffer that fate. So yeah, these are effective and relatable and emotive themes for sure, but they're not really what's cool about Outer Wilds. No, what I think is interesting is how progression within these loops plays out. I like to think of Outer Wilds as a Metroid game at heart, except that instead of upgrades and abilities, the elements which allow further progression and exploration are purely knowledge-based. Upgrades could exist in Outer Wilds, and when I started playing, I was expecting them to show up. Something like an upgrade for my ship, for my spacesuit, maybe some new abilities to complement the radio scanner and probe that you start with. But this never happens, and I really respect the pure focus on information gathering the developers went for instead. I think it results in a much more immersive world, where a new area isn't hidden behind a ledge that's just too far to reach without a double jump, but rather is simply obscured by the player's lack of certain knowledge about how the entire world functions, the nature of quantum objects and the quantum moon being a personal highlight. And Outer Wilds is, at its heart, all about the game world itself. The combat, enemies and dangers you'd find in a Metroid game are roles which are also filled by the world itself, and this world is dangerous indeed. For such a sedate, exploration-focused game, it's also surprisingly brutal. There are no checkpoints or safety nets, and mistakes can and will lead to the particular loop you're on ending prematurely. I really love the feeling of isolation that comes from realising you've messed up and are now stuck floating in space, your ship's marker showing up as being far away on the other side of the solar system. You can try to boost yourself to a nearby planet or space station, but you're probably going to run out of oxygen and die before you get there. Your ship's very helpful autopilot also won't correct you if your set destination ends up requiring you to fly too close to, or even straight through, the sun. These deaths can also be frustrating though, because if you're enjoying exploring a new area, then make a mistake or are killed by some other hazard, you have to go right back to the beginning spot on your home planet and travel all the way back to where you were, assuming you can remember exactly how you got there in the first place. This feeling of frustration was compounded by two things for me. Firstly, the controls. Outer Wilds uses a kind of gravity simulation which can tether you to different bodies in the solar system. Unlike something like Super Mario Galaxy, which uses a very simple approximation of gravity, Outer Wilds leans more towards realism in this area. So, if you're happily stood on a comet which passes by, say, the Sun, a much larger object, then expect the much stronger gravitational pull of the Sun to be able to lift you off of the comet to a fiery demise. Travelling around then, you need to not only be aware of your position, speed, rotation and pitch, but also your relation to the other bodies, specifically their gravitational pull, as well as general hazards like crumbling planets or fireballs launched from nearby moons. This is the kind of thing that will vary from person to person, but personally I found controlling the ship to be continually difficult, and although I became more confident the longer I played, I never truly felt 100% in control. So the act of simply travelling to where I wanted to go, particularly in these instances where I just died, had a tendency to feel somewhat painful and disheartening. This is offset somewhat by a slow, mental mapping of the environments which grows the more you explore, so that eventually you figure out certain shortcuts or safer, shorter routes that will help you get where you want to be more easily. The second compounding issue here comes from the changing state of the world during each time loop. Rather than just acting as a time limit or providing NPC schedules or specific time-scheduled events like in Majora's Mask, in Outer Wilds, as time passes, the world itself changes. Planets crumble, sands shift, ice melts, buildings are sucked through black holes, and so on. Realising how and why these things happen and piecing them all together in your mind, figuring out where to go, when, and why, is a core strength of the game, and provides much of the satisfaction and fun, as well as tying in nicely with the knowledge gathering loop that is at the heart of the game. However, one knock-on effect of this is that certain places or events you might be trying to explore or investigate can only happen at certain times. So again, if you've just died, you might end up just having to wait around for enough time to pass or for the conditions to be just right before you can get back to where you were before. This becomes yet more infuriating if you die again, maybe by being sucked up off of the comet you were waiting on and into the sun, before enough time has passed, forcing you to wait all over again. There is a mechanic which allows you to rest and kill time at bonfires that I did appreciate. However, because there's no real in-game timer, I was never actually sure at which exact point certain things were going to happen, just that they seem to happen early or late in the loop. So the result of using this resting feature would often be just that I'd end up waiting for around 5 minutes rather than 10. Fortunately, the locations in the game are all distinct and well realised, offering their own hazards, puzzles, and gimmicks to play with, as well as a host of wonderful surprises and moments which were genuinely jaw-dropping. The Ash Twins are an obvious highlight, two planets which circle each other as sand is sucked up from the surface of one to gradually fill up the cave systems of the other. The aptly named Brittle Hollow, full of abandoned homes and settlements, is literally falling apart as you explore it, pieces of the planet falling into the black hole at its centre. Of course, you too can fall into this hole if you're not careful, whereupon you'll find yourself deposited out at the edges of the solar system, floating uselessly in the darkness, along with great chunks of rock and pieces of buildings that used to make up the planet and the Nemai's homes. The game is full of these haunting, poignant moments, and that it accomplishes all of this with little dialogue and no cutscenes is all the more impressive. Overall, I have to say that the core loop is much more successful than not. There was some part of me which did miss the acquisition of any new upgrades or abilities, but I'm not sure that's really a mark against the game itself and may say more about how I've been conditioned over the years to expect these kind of things. Not all of the information you gather is directly tied to uncovering new ways to explore the world or solve mysteries about how it works either. Some of it is just flavour about the people who came before you, their relationships, their struggles and their culture. These can be surprisingly touching, especially when paired with the excellent soundtrack by Andrew Pralo. However, I did feel they lent slightly too heavily into simply being notes, when more diverse environmental storytelling seems to have been possible. I felt this the most keenly during areas where these kinds of environmental details do pop up, such as the attempted escape from the Nemai vessel, and are used to really great effect. I don't think this game will be to everyone's taste. I can imagine certain people will really miss some things that are common in open world games like checkpoints, objectives and achievements, and may feel a little lost for what to do or where to go next. I know I felt that at times. But if the focus on self-direction, introspection, discovery, or really any of what I've described in this video sounds even somewhat appealing to you, then I definitely recommend trying Outer Wilds. There's technically a few different ways the game can end, but what I think people would consider to be the proper ending, which I won't spoil here, is full of wonder, full of heart, and a fitting conclusion to a unique and memorable game.